God afton och välkomna till Tema Saudi-Arabien, en dokumentärserie i 3 delar om kungariket Saudi-Arabien. Ett Saudi-Arabien som bara på några decennier stigit fram ur ett medeltida mörker och blivit en ny världsmakt. Alla människor i Sverige och i andra oljehungriga industriländer med för den delen har fått smärtsamt uppleva i den egna plånboken vad denna nya världsmakt har inneburit. I Saudiarabien finns över 1/4 av jordens kända oljereserver. Och de här enorma tillgångarna ger inte bara Saudiarabien en nyckelroll i världspolitiken, utan det sätter också gränser och möjligheter för ekonomisk utveckling här i Sverige och i andra länder. Det moderna Saudiarabiens historia är den mest dramatiska och snabbaste omvälvningen som någon nation har genomgått. Här utspelas ett färgstarkt drama mellan de strängt konservativa muslimska värderingarna som vuxit fram genom århundraden av ett hårt liv i öknen ända sedan profeten Muhammeds dagar, och den västerländska teknologin och kulturen som dånar in i landet i jakten efter guldet i Saudiarabiens enorma kassakista. Det är ett nutidsdrama av stora mått som den här dokumentärserien ger unika inblickar i. Vid en av flera reportageresor de senaste 10 åren i Saudiarabien träffade jag vid ett tillfälle en arabisk affärsman i huvudstaden Riyadh som beskrev utvecklingen på det här sättet. Min far, sa han, hade en kamel som enda tillgång här i livet. Själv kör jag omkring i en Cadillac. Och min son har redan skaffat ett eget jetplan. Och hans son kommer säkert att flyga omkring i ett eget överljudsplan. Men hans son, han är kanske tillbaka på kamelryggen. Det här beskriver den enormt snabba ekonomiska utvecklingen i Saudiarabien, men visar också på oron som finns där för framtiden, vad som händer när oljereserverna kanske börjar sina. Kvällens första program i serien Tema Saudi-Arabien handlar om världens rikaste kungafamilj, om hur ökenkungen Ibn Saud med Muhammeds och svärdets makt enade de stridande stammarna på den arabiska halvön och la grunden till dagens Saudiarabien. Och det här hände för bara 50 år sedan. Men vi får följa historien ända tillbaka till profeten Muhammeds tid på 600-talet i Mekka och Medina, och vilken roll den brittiske äventyraren Lawrence av Arabien spelade för arabernas historia. Tema Saudi-Arabien, kungariket, makten och islam.
Saudi Arabia, a country whose name means oil. Until recent years, a desert kingdom barely mentioned, Saudi Arabia is now the single most important player in the world oil and money markets. It has become a focal point for the Arab and Islamic world and a linchpin in the stability of the Middle East. Never has so much depended on a country or a people about which so little is known.
Well, when I was in school in Europe, I remember vividly trying to pretend not to be an Arab. Because every time you introduce yourself to somebody that you came from Saudi Arabia, the first question was where and who. When you try to tell them where Saudi Arabia was, then where is your camel? Is a camel parked outside? Do you live in tent? Is your harem? And after a few of those, you get tired. So I pretended to be I'm a Greek sometime, and I'm Spaniards, and all sorts of things. So I think that was the first early misconception, that Arabs were always in tents and camels and no houses, no roads. And then the sudden rush of wealth to the Arab world or to the Middle East, and people now associate Arabs with private jets and purchasing banks, corporations, and wheeling and dealing. I think that is the second misconception. And I think the first one is wrong, and the second one is wrong. Really, the Arab is like everybody else. You get the wealthy, you get the poor, you get the middle class. Very ordinary people. Like everywhere else.
Tonight we begin a three-part series that will bring you the most comprehensive look ever filmed behind the closed doors of Saudi Arabia, where few cameras have ever been permitted. We will bring you the country, the people, and the problems their society faces as they undergo one of the fastest modernizations ever experienced by a society. And in the next weeks, we will examine their plans for security, money, oil, and for their relationships with the Western world. It is, in fact, with this man that the story of Saudi Arabia in many ways begins. And it is to understand this history that one begins to understand the Saudi Arabia of today. Ibn Saud grew up a pauper prince in exile, and by the time he died, ruled a kingdom 3 times the size of France, a kingdom which he had conquered and married together by 1932. He ruled for his first 20 years in poverty, and for the last 10 as one of the richest men in the world. When he died, he had accomplished what none before him could do. He had united the tribes that called the sands of Arabia home.
Thousands of years ago, when civilization was in its infancy, the Arabian Peninsula was a land of great mystery to the rest of the world and a land of great wealth. Endless caravans and traders carried cargo to the north from a land that was known throughout the rest of the world as Arabia Felix, contented Arabia. The great cities and houses of the peninsula were legendary. The tombs of Madain Saleh in the north stand as a testimony to the epoch. The southern tip was called by those who saw it the richest nation in the world. These caravans moved across the Levant and the Mediterranean into the lands now part of Russia, Pakistan, Syria, and Afghanistan. They returned laden with silks, ivory, precious stones. Their commodity was more precious, frankincense and myrrh, tapped from the trees of the southern Arabian forest. Frankincense was burned as an incense during the cremation of the dead, and was so rare that workers disrobed at the end of the day to be searched for any traces hidden on their bodies. It was a symbol of great wealth. The Emperor Nero showed his great mourning for his wife Poppaea by lavishing a total year's production of Arabian frankincense on her funeral pyre. Suddenly, history turned, and the wealth of Arabia was no more. Around 100 AD, Christianity took hold under Emperor Constantine, putting an end to the lavish ceremonies, to the cremation of the dead. The demand for the precious frankincense ceased, and the great wealth of the country declined. The once magnificent kingdom lapsed into one of the backwaters of the world, a land of absolute poverty where man's only subsistence came from the dates and camels surrounding them. It was not until nearly 600 years later that this strange, isolated country would again lurch into the eye of the world, based on one factor alone, a prophet named Muhammad, who arose from the obscurity of the Mecca merchant class to form one of the world's major religions, Islam, with Arabia as its center. When Muhammad was in his 40s, He retired to a cave near Mecca to meditate. One day he heard a voice later identified as the angel Gabriel. It ordered him to recite. Muhammad finally recited what were to be the first verses of the Quran. He began to preach a religion that greatly appealed to the masses with its simple, devout worship of one God. He said, "There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his messenger." The last of a long line of prophets that include Jesus, Moses, Abraham, and David, he said they must bow to the will of God and pray to him 5 times a day. They must care for the needy and poor. And during the 9th month of the Muslim year, called Ramadan, they must fast. Finally, once in their lifetime, they should journey to behold God's house, the Kaaba, in a pilgrimage he would call the Hajj. Under Muhammad, Islam spread rapidly throughout Arabia and became so strong that it moved Arabia as the caravans once had from isolation into contact with the world. Muhammad summoned his followers to convert the world as they had the country to Islam. By the time of his death in 632, his armies constituted one of the most powerful military machines ever known, crossing the deserts to spread the tenets of Islam throughout Africa, Asia Minor, and finally as far as Spain and the islands of Malay. Muslims came from around the world to make the holy pilgrimage, the Hajj, and Muhammad's legacy was an incredible sea of humanity journeying to pay homage at the Kaaba. In later years, non-Muslims would be forbidden to enter the city, yet some did. Explorer Richard Burton in 1853 came disguised as an Arab. He wrote, "I have seen religious ceremonies of many lands, but never, nowhere, a sight so solemn, so impressive as this spectacle." But while Arabia was the site of the holy places, as Islam spread, the capital moved elsewhere. Arabia remained destitute, the Hajj bringing in the only money to this vast desert wasteland. The Turkish Empire used it as a link to their more important trade areas. Beyond that, it was an ignored land of poor, warring tribes and families battling for control, of interest to no one beyond the Bedouins who used the sand dunes to raid the cattle and sheep of other tribes. For the families who warred over the territory, control was as constantly shifting as the sands. One of these families was the Saud of the central region. For over 200 years, they had vied for control with the Rashid family of the north. The Saud set up their stronghold in Darija, outside of the present-day city of Riyadh. Their power grew in the 1700s when they formed an alliance with an Islamic fundamentalist leader, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, that proved formidable. Abdul Wahhab's call for a return to the basic principles of Islam appealed to the Bedouins, and the Saud joined with him to champion the cause. As they moved forward to spread the faith, they also spread the domain of the House of Saud, its legitimacy wrapped in the banner of Islam. By the early 1800s, they dominated much of Arabia, but by 1900, Darija had fallen before the forces of the Turks and the Rashids, and the head of the House of Saud fled to exile in Kuwait, his children in his saddlebags. One of them was Ibn Saud. Ibn Saud grew up in Kuwait with one ambition: to return and take Riyadh for the House of Saud. In 1901, when he was 21, he left Kuwait with 40 men mounted on camelback, and in a surprise attack, he recaptured the city from a sleeping sentry and a populace that had grown tired of the harsh Rashid rule. He began to assemble his forces under the banner of Islam. using once again the call of religion his forebears had to draw men from the Bedouin tribes of the Harb, the Alotebi, the Mutair. He appealed to them with religious fervor and with a style of desert warfare they admired. One of the men who fought with him lives in the town of Najran on the southern border with Yemen, where little has changed since the early days of Ibn Saud. At 96, Sheikh Jabir ibn Hussein still governs his tribe from the clay palace he built as a young man. With his sons and grandsons surrounding him, he talked of the early days of anarchy and of civil war and of Ibn Saud.
A little bit about the early days of the kingdom when there was still warfare. How did you make the raids? Was your tribe successful?
The raids of yesterday year, you were never raided by a friend. The raid would come that was led by a man from Yam tribe. They came on horseback, camelback. This meant war. Kill or be killed. And I was leading my people. I had support from the Auf and the Rajir tribes. We fought until we laid down our arms, until we were victorious. By Ibn Saud's own strength, his ability to pacify the area, to establish peace and rules, he conquered the kingdom with the strength of his sword. He rewarded the good people, and the bad people he chopped off their heads. He was a good ruler in every sense. He was able to achieve his goals by his generosity, his goodness, by the sword, and by all honorable things that he did. God has not created anyone as strong as he was, or as benevolent and as good. Ibn Saud knew when to be ruthless and when to be tolerant. Some of his opponents he pardoned. It won their eternal loyalty and also eliminated the need to groom new officials. Children of slain leaders he adopted, expanding his family's reach. Although poor, his generosity was legendary. The Bedouins admired and fought for him, and his victories mounted. The Rashid's land became his. But his conquest proved of little interest to the outside world until in 1906 he turned his attention to his last major contender, Sharif Hussein ibn Ali of Mecca, the great-grandfather of King Hussein of Jordan. Sharif Hussein had been named Emir of the Hijaz, the western part of the kingdom, by the Ottoman government, who continued to eye all of Arabia. Hussein worked to assist the Turks in completing the railway that would link Medina to Damascus and bring the Turks closer to Arabia. With the onset of World War I, however, the equation began to change, and another chapter of history was about to occur for Arabia. The West began to realize that Arabia could be important to them. England wanted a link to her Indian Empire, and the rest of Europe feared for their commercial interests. All were tired of the Ottoman Empire's control of the area. The British wanted to form alliances with whoever ruled Arabia, and sent a fascinating and strange cast of characters to the once isolated desert kingdom to secure Ibn Saud. They were some of the first men of the West he was to meet. Harry St. John Philby was directed to cultivate Ibn Saud as an ally. T.E. Lawrence, later known as Lawrence of Arabia, was sent to Sharif Hussein of Mecca, so that whoever emerged triumphant, the British position in Arabia would be secure. Lawrence persuaded Hussein to drop his long-standing ties with the Turks. Together they attacked the lifeline of the Turkish Empire, the railroad, in a story that Hollywood immortalized for millions in the film Lawrence of Arabia. The Hollywood portrait was erroneous. The real story of Arabia's future lay not with Lawrence or Hussein, but with Ibn Saud. Ibn Saud watched with delight as Hussein, with the aid of the British, routed the Turks, their one enemy in common, and then decided that the time had come to rout Hussein. From 1919 to 1925 came some of the bloodiest battles to be fought in Arabia, and at the end, it was Ibn Saud who emerged victorious. He drove Hussein from the western part of the kingdom and went on to consolidate the rest of the country. Celebration came with victory, and for Ibn Saud's men there were many celebrations. But the marriage bed was as important as the battlefield in uniting the kingdom. Under the Quran, a man was allowed 4 wives at a time. Ibn Saud would prepare for battle by divorcing one, conquer by arms, and marry the conquered chief's daughter to cement the family's allegiance. Ibn Saud had close to 300 wives. Some remained with him throughout the years, while the most unsuccessful were sent home with a thank you gift, never, it is said, having been unveiled. His sons multiplied and became his generals in their teenage years. The combination of the sword and the marriage bed proved victorious. By 1932, Ibn Saud had carved out a kingdom with borders from Iraq in the north to Yemen in the south, from the Red Sea to the Arabian Gulf. He became the first Saud to call himself king and named it Saudi Arabia. He set out to rule, sending his sons to serve as his lieutenants and governors, tying his kingdom, the size of the United States east of the Mississippi, together with a network of tribal chiefs. He added cars to his camels to move his entourage around the country, carrying with them trunks and boxes of government papers. He held a daily majlis in a tent, an open meeting in which any Bedouin could come to him and talk. But Ibn Saud's constant problem remained. He was broke. The kingdom was penniless, and the entire nation's treasury so meager that it was literally portable. One of the early Westerners in Saudi Arabia was Tom Barger. He came as a geologist in 1937. When he left, he was president of the Arabian American Oil Company, Aramco. He remembers the problems that Abdullah Suleiman, the king's treasurer, had.
Moved about the desert, and Abdullah Suleiman carried the treasury along with him in a tin trunk. And then when the money came in from taxes and so on, it was put in there, and when the king decided to spend it, why, it was spent. Saleh said one time they decided they should have an audit on Abdullah Suleiman, that he was being urged by some of the bureaucrats from Jeddah. These auditors came out, and Abdullah Suleiman had his trunk full of chits, and they said, well, how do you keep track of this? Well, he said, I get the money here, and then the king gives a chit to someone and says, give him 100 riyals. He brings it here, I give him 100 riyals, and when there isn't any more money, we don't give him any more. When there is, we give him some. Saudi Arabia was awful poor. Colonel Dixon, for example, in one of his books said that when he came to Kuwait, that he estimated that about almost everyone was hungry most of the time. And I think that was probably about the same in the eastern part of Saudi Arabia. Matter of fact, Aramco, after World War I, got a nutrition to see what we might do about changing the diet that would be helpful. This dietitian came to the conclusion that our lowest 3 tiers of employees ought to be dead.
Oil, the first commodity anybody had been interested in from Arabia since the days of frankincense and myrrh. In 1933, Standard Oil of California saw the same land formations in Arabia that were producing oil in Bahrain. They bid $250,000 with royalties at $1 a ton for the exclusive rights to all of Saudi Arabia's oil for the next 60 years. Ibn Saud grabbed at it. He needed the money and hoped they would find water.
I don't think that very many people in Saudi Arabia really understood what oil was about. The word oil is common in Arabia, but you are talking about vegetable oil for eating and for cooking and so on. The idea of the role of oil plays in a industrial society, I'm sure, was absolutely foreign to nearly all the people. They didn't know exactly what this oil was going to be, what was it going to do, what would happen. General idea was it was somehow supposed to make you rich.
The early explorers boarded the Orient Express and headed for Arabia. And in 1933, the oil exploration, which seemed futile but harmless to Ibn Saud, began in earnest. They came from places like Texas and from Oklahoma, and they pitched their tents, built huts, and grew beards to blend into a desert as alien to them as they were to Ibn Saud. While the oil was gushing in Bahrain, the Saudi team kept exploring and coming up with little. By 1937, it had begun to seem hopeless.
I have heard stories of very violent infighting in the Standard of California board between those who insisted on carrying on because it was such a large area and couldn't possibly be explored properly in the time given, and those who said, well, this was throwing your money down a rat hole in Arabia. There are better things to do with their money. The people who negotiated the concession originally had no idea that they were ever going to find oil in the quantity that they found it in places like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. These are just unheard of. They started the drilling on Dammam Dome in 1934. And they found oil, and I've forgotten exactly how many oil wells, but several, at the same horizon that was producing in Bahrain. And there was great excitement, laying out a pier and laying out a township and so on. And then when they went to production tests on these wells, they didn't produce very much, and they stopped. So this was a terrible blow to everybody involved. And the decision was made then to deepen one of the wells to see if there was something deeper than the zone that was producing in Bahrain. And number 7 was a well that was chosen to deepen, and eventually it came into production in March of 1938. So there was 4.5 years there before it seemed that there was some promising oil in Saudi Arabia.
Dammam 7 was the first well in what would prove to be the world's largest oil reserves. In the great flush of success, they invited Ibn Saud to come to Dhahran for the celebration. In May of 1939, he arrived with his entourage to officially witness the loading of the first tanker at Ras Tanura and to personally open the valves. More probably, he came to inspect the curious Westerners, their strange equipment, and the town at Ras Tanura called Little America that had grown up there. They were all on the threshold of fortune. 4 months later, World War II began. The Italians dropped bombs on Dhahran. The sea lanes became hazardous, and oil development was shut down. Ibn Saud was broke again. During the war, Ibn Saud rarely left his country. One journey he did take, however, is a trip that Barney Smith will never forget. Smith was commander of the SS Murphy, and it was here that East met West. The date was February 1945. The war was almost over. Smith was instructed to proceed to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, and embark Ibn Saud and return him to the SS Quincy for a meeting with President Roosevelt. Navy commanders were schooled in military maneuvers, not diplomacy, and Smith was worried about how to accommodate this desert king.
We invited the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister to come on board and to view the accommodations that had been set aside for the king. Well, they did that. They returned to the ship with us. And when we showed them the Commodore's cabin, which is to be occupied by the king, he was absolutely shocked. Apparently it reminded him of a cell. because it is very small to bunk in it, and a wash basin and a desk. And he said that was absolutely unsuitable, and something must be done. He said the king only sleeps under canvas or in the palace, or in one of these palaces. Well, obviously we didn't have a palace available, so then we said, neither do we have canvas. And the foreign minister said, I can arrange for you to have all the canvas you need if you will build the tent. So very shortly thereafter, boats arrived alongside with rolls and rolls of canvas.
Building a tent on the foredeck was only the first of Smith's problems.
And then the question of the chair came up. And he said, where will the king sit? And we showed him a very rugged wardroom chair made out of steel or aluminum. The foreign minister said, impossible. Said the king cannot sit there.
Very shortly thereafter, a more comfortable chair for the king, now older and somewhat ailing, arrived. It was placed on the bow underneath the canvas. The king sat there during the trip, talking to and conferring with his subjects.
It developed that the party contemplated by the Saudi Arabians consisted of 200 people. There would be the king and 5 of the members of the royal family, his astrologer, his doctor, his cook, coffee servers, various servants, and the leaders of all the tribes of Arabia. We protested about this and stated that it would be impossible to take 200. And Colonel Eddy stated that we were prepared to embark 10. Actually, when the Murphy departed Jeddah, we had on board 48, plus the king.
The distraught crew thought that everything was finally settled when a barge carrying sheep pulled alongside the Murphy. The king, by tradition, expected to feed the entire crew. Ultimately, 8 sheep were brought on board, prepared in the traditional manner and enjoyed by Saudis and Americans alike. After 2 days, the Murphy pulled alongside the Quincy and offloaded its passenger, Ibn Saud, for his meeting with President Roosevelt. Roosevelt told Ibn Saud of the horrors that the European Jews had suffered under Hitler and asked his help in relocating them to Palestine. Ibn Saud concurred on the tragedy, but not on the solution. Why, he asked, didn't the Germans give the Jews a portion of their Rhine Valley, since they had been the ones who had wronged them? Roosevelt listened and promised he would not make any changes in the Palestinian policy without consulting Ibn Saud further. William Eddy, shown here accompanying the king, was the first U.S. minister to Saudi Arabia. He chronicled the promises made that day as well as the subsequent unforeseen events. Within weeks of the meeting, Roosevelt died. Truman became president. Eddy writes that Truman summoned his ministers to the Arab countries and told them, I'm sorry, gentlemen, but I have to answer to hundreds of thousands of people who are anxious for the success of Zionism. I do not have hundreds of thousands of Arabs among my constituents. Thus went Roosevelt's promise to Ibn Saud. Work in the oil fields resumed after World War II, and Saudi Arabia, the poor rat hole SoCal once considered closing, came up with the greatest reserves the world had ever known. Oil flowed at a rate never before seen. The money from it went to the oil companies for the most part, but also to the king, a man with a lifetime of debts. The promise of oil had come true, and by the end of his life, Ibn Saud received more money than he ever thought possible. $3 million a week gushed in from oil revenues, and along with it, a transformation of his desert kingdom that seemed beyond him. He built a new palace in Riyadh. Here he housed his offspring and wives. He disappeared into his harem in the evenings and held his majlis by day, where ambassadors and Bedouins alike entered and were treated the same. He introduced the telephone to his conservative constituency by reciting into it from the Quran, then declaring that anything that carried the word of God could not be evil, silencing objections. At the same time, he worried out loud to men like Barger that maybe things were changing too fast. Foreigners from all over the world began pouring into his kingdom, each one bringing suggestions of how to spend the country's wealth. Whoever the visitor, all were treated in true desert hospitality and showered with gifts of swords, horses, and gold watches upon their departure. The last of Ibn Saud's children was born when he was 67, and it saddened him that he could have no more. His sons numbered 42. His daughters were never actually counted. He raised his sons as desert princes had always been raised, and educated them in the Quran and desert lore with little formal schooling or knowledge of the world they would have to deal with, the world that Saudi Arabia could no longer ignore. He hoped they would carry on his work and the word of the Quran. Ibn Saud died quietly in Taif in 1953. By tradition, he was buried in an unmarked grave. Saud, the oldest son, would be king. But it was to his second son, Faisal, that the affairs of state would fall. Turki al-Faisal is now head of Saudi intelligence. He agreed to talk about his father's early years and education.
Growing up in the desert, learning the skills of the desert, how to track, how to survive in the desert, learning how to ride horses, and some of the skills of self-defense, using a dagger or a sword. But it was not until about his 10th year, I suppose, that he was taken back, as it were, into the affairs of state at the time by King Abdulaziz. It was then, between the ages of 10 and 12, that he was given his first assignment, actually his first official assignment, by being appointed ambassador to the peace conference in Paris.
He saw and was enthralled by the many sights of the Western world. Guided by Ibn Saud's old confidant, Harry St. John Philby, Faisal even visited an early television station.
You can imagine the impact it must have had on him, going to England, which was then the heart of the Western civilization, and then moving from there to Paris, where that big and rather dazzling assembly was being held by the many heads of state, President Wilson, the Prime Minister of England, the Prime Minister of France and Italy, and so on. And here was a 13-year-old boy representing a desert king, of whom very few people had heard at the time, presuming to speak for his father's interests. It must have been a tremendous experience for him. And I think throughout his life, he benefited from that trip. He was able to see the West at a time when it was still very awe-inspiring, and it was still talking about idealism and ideals. And if you remember the Wilson program at the time, that had spoken about human rights and so on. So for a boy of 13, it was quite an experience.
By the time Faisal was grown, he and his kingdom had been drawn into the very center of the world he had seen as a boy. As oil money flowed into the kingdom, both the Arab and the Western nations turned to it. Faisal became the king's representative to the world. He was named both prime minister and foreign minister when his brother Saud assumed the throne in 1953. He then began to establish relations with the Arab countries which had previously looked to them as keepers of Islam's holy cities, but never as a power. He also established new bonds with the Western nations. The United States, like the rest of the world, was growing more dependent daily upon Saudi oil. Faisal returned to Great Britain as a courted leader of a moderate Arab nation on whom they hoped to depend for a stable oil supply and a steady leadership. Tired eyes replaced the wide-eyed wonder of a child's first visit at age 13. His problems back home, however, continued to grow. Despite the country's increased income, excesses and extravagances were sinking the country into economic chaos and debt. Not seeming to understand that the days of the old-style desert king were over, King Saud lived in a grandiose style with hundreds of wives and thousands of sycophants. He ignored the protests from citizens and military alike, using the treasury as his personal pocketbook. Tom Baga remembers.
Well, yes, he certainly did live in a high style in the sense of having all kinds of servants about and chandeliers and yards and miles, it seemed, of carpets with chandeliers running down the middle. But he was a very unhappy man in the end, and he had all kinds of physical ailments that didn't contribute to his well-being. A kingdom that could withstand the King Saud and not fall apart is certainly not unstable. He left the country absolutely broke, but the country survived, and by its own means.
What sort of a fellow was he?
Oh, he was a harmless man. He was not a malicious man, but he had really no sense of proportion. He didn't seem to know anything about how you should run a government, and he was simply a disaster.
Times had changed, obviously, from the time when the king could spend and demand obedience and allegiance from his subjects in the manner that King Abdulaziz did. One thing that King Faisal always recognized in himself was that he was not like King Abdulaziz. And I think this was a great asset in his life. Yes, he accepted King Abdulaziz as an example to follow, but he also recognized that the times of King Abdulaziz were different, that the personality of King Abdulaziz allowed him to do things that he would not be able to do, and that he didn't think others would be able to do. I think this is the major difference that occurred between him and King Saud, where King Saud wanted to do things that King Abdulaziz did, thereby losing some of his own personality in the process. This led to the conflict between them.
As Faisal traveled abroad to conduct the kingdom's business, the bizarre and grandiose image of Saud was projected onto him at every turn.
Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Faisal arrives for medical consultations about his ulcer, a complaint which limits his breakfast diet to caviar. He was accompanied by a party of 25, including only one of his 6 wives. With over 100 pieces of luggage to keep track of, he's got worries enough to feed that ulcer.
Saud's debts mounted. The unmanaged government began to dissolve into a shambles. Finally, religious elders and the royal family concurred. Saud must go. In 1964, they called for him to step down. He spent his life pensioned off on endless travels to Europe until he died in Greece in 1969. His many children remained a part of the Saudi dynasty. Faisal became king.
He would have rather remained in the background, working for the king, making the king's life easier, as it were, than for himself to be the man who had the power of rule in Saudi Arabia. But his faith in Islam and his faith in the people of Saudi Arabia were so great that when he was proclaimed king, he accepted it as a matter of fact rather than as the event that would crown his career.
Faisal's coronation celebration would be one of the rare moments when the responsibilities he had carried since he was a boy could be momentarily forgotten. Perhaps because of a lifetime of responsibility, Faisal was different from his father or his brother, a quiet, unostentatious, and private man. Now he was faced with a Herculean task, how to turn around a country whose economy was in a shambles despite ever-increasing money, and how to implement modernization and social reforms as it lurched from the 12th to the 21st century overnight. Just as his father introduced the telephone against strong opposition, Faisal now introduced television and schooling for girls against equally vigorous dissent, struggling to balance necessary changes with age-old tradition. He brought in advisors from around the world to help build cities and roads, to institute financial controls and banking systems. In short, he embarked upon a process of modernization unparalleled in the history of the world.
Faisal's impact on Saudi Arabia was indeed extraordinary. It was during his rule that the great thrust of modernization took place. It was during his rule that government essentially began to become modern, that a whole new administrative bureaucracy.
Malcolm Peck is one of the leading historians on the rule of King Faisal.
What perhaps will be most remembered about Faisal was the degree of success with which he accommodated this extraordinary movement towards rapid modernization with basic Islamic cultural values. And if there is a secret, I think, to his success in bringing Saudi Arabia into the modern era, it lies there.
Faisal's main foreign policy problem was no less difficult: Palestine. In London in 1936, Faisal, representing his father, had looked on as the British tried to straighten out the conflicting promises made to both the Jews and the Arabs at the time of World War I regarding the territory of the Middle East. British troops stationed in Palestine had tried to effect a balance, but tensions grew. Arabs were frustrated and angered by ever-increasing Jewish immigration of the 1920s. Jews, with a new ideology, had come to cultivate and settle. The Zionist movement was growing. Over the next 15 years, coexistence was tried and proved futile. Full-scale riots ensued. The rise of Hitler increased immigration. Partition became inevitable. In 1947, the British packed up and the United Nations took over, voting to partition Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. Faisal spoke out. Saudi Arabia, he said, refuses to be bound by a partition agreement. Israel proclaimed itself a state in 1948. The Arabs were enraged. As war broke out, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled, vowing to return.
He felt at the time of the creation of Israel that it was an imposition on the Middle East, that it was an unfair denial of the rights of the Palestinians, and of course he felt very strongly about the issue of Jerusalem, since as defender of the shrines of Islam in Mecca and Medina, he felt a particular responsibility towards those in Jerusalem, which are only less important than those in Mecca and Medina.
Faisal also felt the Palestinian refugees had been removed from their rightful land. He feared the effect these homeless refugees might have on the stability of his and other Arab countries, and he feared that the Russians might take advantage of the instability the situation produced.
Faisal was not only very strongly anti-communist, he was opposed very strongly to all sorts of radicalism, secular radicalism, and this embraced, together with communism, Zionism. Indeed, it embraced radical Arab nationalism. He felt that all of these things were somehow linked, that they were all a very serious threat to the security of Saudi Arabia, and indeed to Islamic society generally.
He said that the United States, by supporting Israel, alienates all of the Arabs and all of the Muslims. That this act...
James Akins, former U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia during the reign of King Faisal, remembers his fears.
He said, and in fact, I've heard him say this, that you, by supporting Israel, were responsible for every anti-Western revolution in the Middle East, and you are endangering even me. That is, he said that you must look at this from the point of view of your own interests. Do not serve the interests of communism by supporting Israel. He went even farther than that. He believed that there was a conspiracy between Israel and the Russians to eliminate American interests from the Middle East.
Faisal dealt cautiously while extending aid to Arab neighbors, such as Syria and Iraq. Many had closer ties to the Soviet Union than he wished, and some, such as President Nasser in Egypt, had even militated for the demise of the Saudi royal government. He cultivated the younger Sadat, who had no such affection for the Soviets, and hoped he would succeed Nasser. Few thought Faisal sought leadership of the Arab world, simply its stability. The 1967 war proved a shock and a turning point for the region and for Faisal.
Major disappointment of his life, if you like, was the impact of the 1967 war on him and the Arab world. He was a man deeply committed to the interests of the Arab world and the Muslim world. And in 1967, both received a tremendous setback by the defeat of the Arabs at the hands of Israel and the loss of Jerusalem.
The war left Egypt and Jordan humiliated and truncated. Faisal responded by opening up his coffers and extending more aid to his Arab colleagues, and by talking to the West. Faisal visited Nixon in 1971 to ask him to exert the United States' leadership in the area to bring about peace.
Having the benefit of your wise counsel as one of the senior statesmen of the world on how our two nations can work together for a just and secure peace in the Mideast and in all parts of the world.
Faisal indicated the points of conflict between Saudi Arabia and the United States in his reply. The tensions between America and the Arab and Muslim states, he said, arose directly from the Israeli occupation of Palestine and Jerusalem and from the Israeli aggression against the Palestinian people. Throughout 1973, Faisal implored the United States to listen to the Arab grievances. He implied that unless the United States forced Israel to withdraw from occupied Arab territories and to settle with the Palestinians, Saudi Arabia would slow down oil production. In October 1973, a week after the Egyptian and Syrian attacks on the Israeli-occupied territories, the United States instituted a massive airlift of military equipment to Israel. Then Congress allocated additional billions in economic assistance. Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries decided to act. They embargoed oil to the United States. OPEC prices spiraled. The Western world panicked and bid up the prices. Gas lines, inflation, and recession ensued. The world began to realize that it was witnessing the most dramatic transfer of money and power in history, from Western powers to the OPEC countries, and Faisal was the leader of the most powerful. Faisal, whose father, Ibn Saud, had founded an isolated desert kingdom a little more than 40 years earlier, now held the keys to the world's economic welfare. He oversaw a country where $29 billion a year flowed in from oil and used the oil weapon to focus attention on Arab grievances. Few leaders had ever impacted so dramatically, so fast, on the entire world. Time magazine named him their Man of the Year in 1975. Within weeks of Time's cover, he was dead, shot by his own nephew, whose brother had been killed during the suppression of the anti-television revolts.
He decided to kill the king, for whom he had developed tremendous distaste, and whom he believed represented the ultimate symbol of order in Saudi Arabia. And for this nephew of his who wanted to, or who had the ambition, if you like, to try to affect disorder in Saudi Arabia getting rid of the symbol of order was the most important element. And he used his position within the royal family to gain attendance to the king. And he took out a pistol and shot him in his office, actually, contrary to what the press had said about that the late king was attending a religious ceremony. He wasn't. He was in his office meeting with a foreign visitor at the time. And this man came in, and while the king was greeting the visitor, he took out his gun and shot him.
The world was shocked. In the tumultuous world of Middle East politics and governments, Saudi Arabia had become one of the few points of stability and friendship to the West, which was by then overwhelmingly dependent upon Saudi oil. And they wondered how the country and how they would fare as the mantle passed to Faisal's brother Khalid. Under Faisal, it had been a moderate Arab nation, but what would happen under another leader? Would it even survive? Faisal had successfully pulled Saudi Arabia out of the 12th century into the eye of the world. But how would the country, its leaders, and its people deal with the dizzying pace of development he had committed them to without Faisal himself at the helm?
Saudi Arabia that has emerged today is a mystery to most. In our next episode, we take our cameras inside the country for a rare look at the Saudi personal lives and the Saudi system. We bring you inside the country, inside Saudi homes for unprecedented interviews with men and women on how their society actually works, how they live their lives, and the enormous questions before them. Join us for our next episode, Saudi Arabia, the Race with Time.